Have you ever kept a family secret for decades? I won't ask what, just curious.
They told me not to come to Thanksgiving this year. No explanation, no apology, just a text from my brother 2 nights before, worded like a corporate memo. Hey, just a heads up, we're keeping it exclusive this year. Smaller circle, just immediate family. The irony didn't hit me until later, that I apparently no longer qualified as immediate. I stared at the message for a good 5 minutes, wondering if he was even aware of how sharp it came across, or if he truly thought I'd read it and say, "Sure, makes sense, thanks for the courtesy." There was no phone call, no follow-up, just the silence of people who had already decided you were no longer part of their story. I didn't reply. I didn't need to. I'd seen this moment coming from so far back that when it finally arrived, it didn't even sting the way it should have. It felt inevitable, like the final confirmation of something I'd already known in my bones since last Thanksgiving, maybe longer. The sad part wasn't that I was being excluded. The sad part was how normal it felt. Like the final unspoken rule of a club I was never allowed to join in the first place. It wasn't like I hadn't seen the signs. Over the years, my role in the family became quieter, smaller, easier to overlook. While my brother, Danny, climbed the ranks of his real estate firm and his wife posted pictures of dinner parties with wine labels I couldn't pronounce, I was always described with qualifiers. She's finding her way, they'd say to distant relatives or neighbors at church. She's creative. She's doing something with tech. When I launched my first startup, no one asked about it. When I raised my first million, no one even noticed. When I failed 3 times after that, I stopped sharing altogether because their silence felt more suffocating than any failure ever could. Last Thanksgiving, I showed up with homemade pumpkin bread and got seated at the kids' table literally. My brother's wife, Christine, said it was just easier with the seating chart, which somehow meant her Pilates instructor got a spot at the main table, but I got stuck next to a 6-year-old chewing on a napkin. That was also the night she accidentally mentioned that Danny was investing in a startup run by one of her cousin's friends, an app one had pitched 6 months earlier, which they dismissed as too ambitious. They laughed about how the founder had no formal degree, as if it was charming when it came from a Stanford dropout with perfect teeth, but pathetic when it came from me. So yeah, when I got the text this year, I didn't cry. I didn't beg or ask why. I went to the store, bought one of those sad little frozen Thanksgiving dinners with gray turkey slices and a scoop of mashed potatoes that looked like it was sprayed out of a caulk gun, and I brought it home. I lit a candle, just to give the illusion of warmth, and sat down in front of my small TV. I had the game on, even though I don't give a damn about football. It was background noise, something to fill the room that wasn't silence. I poured myself a glass of red wine, the kind with a twist-off cap, and tried to convince myself this was fine. That this was freedom. That not having to pretend with them anymore was a gift. And then something happened. Right after halftime, while the commentators were dissecting a fumble that seemed to matter more than world hunger, the broadcast cut out. Not in a glitchy way, no. This was clean, intentional, a smooth transition like the kind you see when a network drops a breaking news story that just can't wait. The screen faded to black for a split second, and then my face appeared. Not a photo. A live shot. Me, standing at a podium, wearing the navy blazer I'd picked out months ago for this exact moment. Behind me, the Nexera logo lit up the screen in clean, bold letters. Below it, in massive text that even my legally blind grandmother could have read, it said, Nexera announces $90 million acquisition deal. CEO Emily Reynolds speaks live. And there I was. Me, the background girl. The black sheep. The one who brought pumpkin bread and got asked to help with dishes instead of share her story. My voice, calm and practiced, filled the living room. I had rehearsed it 1,000 times. I spoke about innovation and market shifts and building something from the ground up. I spoke like a woman who knew what she was worth. The irony? The company I just bought was the same one my brother bragged about working with last Christmas. The same one he said would revolutionize the future of remote real estate management. Now it was mine. All of it. I hadn't told anyone. Not even my closest friends. Because I wanted this exact moment to unfold the way it was unfolding now, organically, live, and completely undeniable. Then my phone buzzed. At first, I thought maybe it was a press notification or one of my investors sending congrats. But no, it was Danny, my brother. The same one who had texted me 2 days ago to tell me Thanksgiving was exclusive. Now he was texting, "Proud of you." That's all he wrote. 3 words. Like they somehow erased the last 3 years of silence. Like they patched over every condescending glance, every family dinner where I was talked over, laughed at, or flat out ignored. Proud of me. For what exactly? For proving him wrong? For making a deal big enough to show up on the NFL broadcast? I stared at the message for a while. I didn't reply. I didn't even smile. I just looked back at the TV, at the camera catching my every word, and I let myself feel it for the first time in years. The rage, the satisfaction, the quiet, dangerous power of being underestimated for too long. What would you have done? Would you have replied? Would you have forgiven? Or would you have waited, because you knew this was only the first move? Thanksgiving morning came like it always did, but this time it didn't bring the scent of roasting turkey, or the chaotic buzz of voices overlapping in my mother's kitchen, or even the distant, familiar groan of folding chairs being dragged from the garage to make room for one more cousin who'd never RSVP'd, but always showed up. Instead, it arrived with a bitter chill in the air, the kind that seemed to slip under your skin no matter how many layers you wore, and with it came an emptiness that didn't feel quite like loneliness, but more like a long-delayed clarity, an awareness that this wasn't just a bad year or a temporary drift. No, this was the shape of things now, and maybe it always had been. I woke up in the silence of my one-bedroom apartment, which, despite being modest, was entirely mine, bought outright, renovated by hand, paid for with money no one in my family had ever asked about. The blinds were half drawn, letting in that pale gray light that always makes the world outside look like it's holding its breath. I didn't set an alarm the night before because, frankly, there was nothing to wake up for. No reason to dress up. No reason to drive. No reason to smile through clenched teeth and pretend that the little digs from Christine didn't land, that the passive-aggressive jokes about how the tech world is just full of dreamers these days didn't burrow deep. I made coffee the way I liked it, strong enough to kick me in the chest, and sat at the kitchen table with the one plate I'd bothered to prepare, a small slice of quiche from the freezer section. The kind they wrap in plastic like it's a sad little prize for someone who forgot the holiday entirely. I wasn't trying to be dramatic, I wasn't making a statement, I just didn't see the point of pretending anymore. That kitchen table had seen my worst nights, failed pitches, empty accounts. Nights where I sat staring at my laptop wondering what kind of idiot thinks she can build something from scratch in a world that only hands out opportunities to people who already look like success. But that same table had also seen something else, my first investor check, the email confirming I'd been accepted into an accelerator program. The moment I realized I didn't have to wait for someone to invite me to the table if I was willing to build my own. Still, that morning I allowed myself one small indulgence in the form of masochism. I opened Instagram. It was like watching a movie I'd already seen but couldn't look away from. There was Christine, perfectly lit in some overpriced kitchen wearing a cream sweater that cost more than my first car, posing with a turkey she clearly didn't cook and captioning it grateful for family, food, and blessings beyond measure. There were my parents, smiling wide in a group photo surrounded by faces I hadn't seen in a year, their arms linked around Danny and his kids, none of whom had apparently asked where I was, or if I was coming, or if I was okay. The comments were full of people saying how beautiful the family looked, how lucky they were, how full their hearts must be, and I couldn't help but feel that sharp, familiar stab of being erased, not absent, not missed, just erased. Like I'd never been part of it to begin with. I thought back to the last time I was there, sitting at that overcrowded table with a cracked gravy boat and overcooked stuffing, listening to Christine brag about her podcast guest spots while Danny scrolled through his phone, nodding politely whenever anyone said something that didn't concern him directly. That day, I'd mentioned, just briefly, that I was working on something, a product, a platform that was getting attention in a niche market. I remember the exact moment I said it, the way the room kind of froze, not out of awe, but confusion. My mom smiled the way people smile at kids when they say they want to be astronauts. My dad asked if it was a real company or just one of those internet things. Then Christine chuckled and asked if I was still doing that little startup stuff, like I was finger painting and playing dress up while the rest of them handled the real world. What they didn't know, and what I didn't tell them, was that I'd already been in talks with a group of private investors. That I'd already secured seed funding. That the product wasn't little, and it wasn't a project, and it sure as hell wasn't temporary. But I kept it quiet because I knew what I was building needed space, privacy, and control, 3 things I'd never had around them. Every idea I'd ever floated near that table had been picked apart, dismissed, or politely ignored. Every ambition I'd expressed had been repackaged as a cute hobby, something they'd tolerate until I settled down, until I figured things out. But I wasn't lost. I was just quiet. There's a difference. And that difference was going to cost them. Because while they toasted their glasses and took selfies in front of a rented wreath, they didn't know that I was about to own a piece of the very company that kept Danny's name on the boardroom wall. They didn't know that the startup I'd poured my soul into for nearly 6 years had just signed a merger deal with one of the largest logistics platforms on the East Coast. They didn't know that by the time dessert hit the table, I would be richer, more powerful, and more visible than anyone in that room had ever imagined. And maybe, if I'm being honest, it wasn't even about the money. Maybe it was about the moment, the sweet, slow burn of recognition I'd never gotten, coming not in the form of a compliment or a hug or a toast, but in the way their mouths would fall open when they realized the daughter they had treated like a footnote had been writing her own headline all along. So I sat back in my chair, watching the posts pile up, the fake gratitude spilling from every filtered photo, and I didn't feel anger or sadness or jealousy. I felt something better. I felt ready. Because I knew what was coming. And they didn't. If there's one thing people underestimate more than a quiet woman at the edge of a family dinner table, it's a quiet woman with a long memory and a plan so well hidden it looks like nothing at all until it explodes in their living rooms during the 3rd quarter of Thanksgiving football. What they didn't know, what none of them had bothered to ask over the years as they smiled politely and changed the subject whenever I opened my mouth, was that I'd been building something, not just a company, not just a product, but a strategy layered deep enough that even I sometimes forgot how personal it really was. Because it started with failure. And like most women who are used to being dismissed before they finish their first sentence, I learned how to fail with precision, how to fall quietly, how to make every crash look like a step back when it was really a sidestep towards something sharper. In the early days, my startup was little more than an idea scribbled into a coffee-stained notebook, born during those long months when I was freelancing just to keep the lights on, living off instant ramen and bitterness. I didn't have a team, or a CTO, or a co-founder with the kind of name that got investors to lean forward in their chairs. What I had was time, hunger, and a long list of every conversation where someone talked over me, corrected me unnecessarily, or looked at me like I was cute for trying. The tech world doesn't run on kindness. It runs on audacity, timing, and connections that usually require a last name with history. I had none of those. What I had was stubbornness and the kind of cold-burning focus that comes from being doubted by people who think they know you. I knew I had one shot, maybe 2 at best. So I learned everything. I taught myself to code, not because I wanted to be a developer, but because I couldn't afford to wait for someone to build my vision for me. I studied markets at 2 in the morning, attended startup webinars in different time zones, cold emailed advisors who didn't answer until the 3rd or 4th message, and slowly, almost invisibly, I began to stitch together something that resembled a company. At first, it was small, a logistics software tool for independent vendors and warehouse operators, built to solve a problem that no one at Thanksgiving ever asked me about because none of them knew what I did, and worse, none of them cared to know. But out in the real world, away from family barbecues and baby showers, I was never invited to people were paying attention. By the time I raised my first $2 million in seed funding, I'd already been dismissed by over 100 angel investors, some of whom told me to find a male co-founder if I wanted to be taken seriously. I kept a list of their names. Not out of spite, okay? Maybe a little out of spite, but mostly because I wanted to remember who told me no, so that one day, when the answer became yes, I wouldn't forget who waited to believe in me until it was convenient. And then came Nexera. The merger didn't happen overnight. It started, as most tectonic shifts do, with something quiet, a conversation in a side room at a conference in Denver, with a man whose assistant had booked me into a 15-minute time slot that turned into 90. He didn't care what school I went to, or how many social media followers I had, or that I'd never once made a Forbes under 30 list. He cared that I knew my numbers, that I understood the pain points of an industry that was still clinging to outdated platforms and inefficiencies that cost millions annually, that I had a solution, not a slogan. From that moment, the pieces started to move. Slowly, then quickly. Investors began to circle. Advisors I hadn't heard from in months resurfaced with offers to lend support. Former doubters rewrote history, suddenly claiming they always knew I had it. I let them talk. I nodded. I smiled. Because I had already decided how this was going to play out, and it wasn't going to end in a press release quietly buried under the week's tech news. No, it was going to end loud, in the living rooms of every person who had forgotten to invite me, every person who had underestimated me, every person who thought Emily's working on her little project was something to say with a half smirk. I chose the date of the announcement. Thanksgiving Day. Not because I wanted to be petty, well, maybe a little, but because I wanted precision. I knew exactly when the merger would be finalized. I knew exactly what time the announcement would air, piggybacked onto the halftime ad buy we negotiated months earlier, slotted neatly between two high-profile commercials so no one could miss it. I knew exactly what I would wear, how I would sound, which camera to look at, and which words to emphasize. I knew the power of seeing a familiar face in an unfamiliar context, especially when that face belongs to the person you thought was still working behind a counter somewhere, probably folding napkins. So when the screen cut from the football game to my live broadcast, I wasn't surprised. I was prepared. The reporters called it a stunning merger, an unexpected power move, a defining moment in East Coast logistics. The number flashed across the screen like a scoreboard, $90 million. A figure so loud, it drowned out a lifetime of being ignored. But what they didn't know, and what I wasn't about to tell them, was that this wasn't just business. This was personal. Because the company I acquired? It wasn't just any logistics firm. It was the same one Danny's firm had partnered with last year. The same one he bragged about during that Thanksgiving dinner, casually tossing around buzzwords he didn't understand, saying how the future was all about tech-enabled fulfillment channels, like he'd invented the phrase himself. And now? Now I owned it. Quietly. Completely. His name wasn't on any document, but mine was on every single one. And when his face turned pale watching the screen, and when his fingers hesitated before texting me, and when he wrote, "Proud of you," like he hadn't spent the last 5 years pretending I didn't exist, that was when I knew. The deal wasn't the end of the story. It was the beginning of something much more satisfying. The message from Danny, those 3 absurdly casual words, "Proud of you," landed in my inbox with the weight of a wrecking ball wrapped in velvet, deceptively soft and almost laughably empty if you held it up against the years of avoidance, dismissal, and tightly packed, smiling indifference that had become the core of our so-called sibling relationship. There was no punctuation, no added warmth, no link to the press release, not even a question mark implying he wanted to open a real conversation, just that flat, performative nod, as if he could hop back into my life through a side door and act like we were still close enough for this to count as a moment between us. I didn't reply, not immediately, and not because I was overwhelmed or stunned or needed time to process anything, but because in that moment I understood, with terrifying clarity, just how deep the disconnect between us really ran, and how little he grasped of what that broadcast had truly meant. He thought it was about success, about money, about some glow-up that could now be turned into a shared family trophy. But it wasn't. It was about the reckoning I had built with my own hands, and the fire I had kept hidden beneath the surface while he and everyone around him treated me like the family's unfinished sketch, a portrait no one bothered to hang. The texts kept coming, not just from him but from others too, people I hadn't spoken to in years, people who had declined my LinkedIn requests or forgotten to congratulate me when I graduated. People who used to send me forwarded job listings from Craigslist with little smiley faces and notes like, "This could be a good stepping stone." My inbox turned into a mosaic of belated admiration, shallow surprise, and thinly veiled opportunism. Some were subtle, like Christine's message that read, "Wow, that announcement was so impressive, let's definitely catch up soon." The digital equivalent of her swanning up beside me at Thanksgiving to clink wine glasses and pretend she hadn't once said to my face, "You're just not a business type, you know?" But beneath the noise, under the bright veneer of faux supportive messages and recycled compliments, I saw something else creeping in: confusion, unease. The kind of squirming curiosity that surfaces when people start to realize they've misjudged someone not for weeks or months, but for years, and now have no idea where they stand. Because it wasn't just that I'd succeeded, it was the manner in which I'd done it. Quietly. Without approval. Without help. And now, publicly. Unavoidable. Broadcasted live into their Thanksgiving dinners like some holy interruption, forcing them to look up from their casseroles and see me not as the awkward relative struggling to explain whatever it is she does in the tech world, but as someone real. Someone they couldn't ignore anymore. I spent that night in a kind of stillness that was almost euphoric, not joyful exactly, but clean, like something had been peeled off my skin that I'd worn so long I forgot it wasn't part of me. I didn't go out to celebrate. I didn't drink champagne or post on social media. I didn't even turn on the lights in my apartment for a while, preferring the soft hum of the TV screen and the rhythmic buzz of my phone lighting up with every new message. I just sat there and thought about the years I had spent dragging myself forward, 1 inch at a time, through all the noise and condescension and well-meaning pity that came disguised as love. I remembered the worst of it, not the big moments, not the Thanksgiving snubs or the family jokes at my expense, but the quieter humiliations. The time my father introduced me to a friend of his as our daughter who's between things right now. Even though I was 2 years into building my first platform, the time Danny offered to put in a word for me at his company, saying they always had room for someone in admin, because at least it's stable, right? The countless dinners where everyone talked over me and I learned to smile with my mouth closed, so I wouldn't say something that would make the room colder than it already was. So no, I didn't reply to Danny that night. Instead, I opened a folder on my laptop, one I hadn't looked at in weeks, and reviewed the document inside. The final draft of a memo I'd written not out of malice, but out of inevitability. It was titled Holiday Restructure, Internal Memo, Reynolds Family Trust, and while it looked like a bland HR release from the outside, its implications were sharp, targeted, and specific. It was about legacy assets. Real estate holdings. Tax-shielded structures built around the Reynolds family name that my grandfather had established decades ago and which, through a combination of blind loyalty and sloppy management, had now come under my control through a series of acquisitions no one in the family had bothered to understand. That was the thing about building something quietly. If you're smart, if you're strategic, you don't just build a business. You build leverage. I could have kept it all separate, my personal story, my business trajectory, my fractured family history, but the truth was, they were already intertwined. This wasn't just about making them uncomfortable. This was about making them aware. And not in a vengeful way, not in the melodrama of look at me now, but in a cold, measured, unflinching way that left no room for misinterpretation. Because they didn't get to erase me and then decide they were proud. They didn't get to lock me out of rooms and then pat me on the back when I built my own skyscraper. I looked at the clock. Midnight. Thanksgiving was officially over. The message I eventually sent wasn't to Danny. It wasn't to my parents. It wasn't to Christine or any of the cousins who'd forgotten my birthday 3 years in a row. I sent one email that night to the legal liaison managing the trust restructuring, confirming that I approved the disbursement hold on 3 family properties until further notice, pending an internal compliance review. I didn't send it with anger. I sent it with clarity. Because when someone finally sees you, after years of pretending not to, the last thing you owe them is comfort. Sometimes, The only way to be heard is to make silence impossible. In the days that followed the broadcast, the text messages didn't just continue, they multiplied, like ants swarming toward something sweet. Only the sweetness in this case wasn't genuine admiration or familial warmth, but the scent of relevance. The sudden realization that I was now someone people wanted to be associated with, someone whose name might open doors or sprinkle a bit of glitter on their own otherwise unremarkable lives, and while I wasn't surprised by the surge of attention, I was struck by the seamlessness with which those who had once scoffed, ignored, or barely tolerated my presence now rebranded themselves as lifelong supporters, like they'd always believed, like they'd just been waiting for the right moment to clap. Christine, ever the master of shallow sincerity, had gone from radio silence to a flurry of messages, screenshots of my face on business news sites with "so proud of you" scribbled over them, links to articles she clearly hadn't read, and finally, a nauseating invitation to join her on her podcast for a deep, personal conversation about building something from nothing, as if we were sisters in arms, as if the woman who once told me to stop chasing fantasies and get a stable job could now feign solidarity with a straight face. I didn't reply. Not because I was bitter, although there was certainly a satisfaction in the restraint, but because I'd already moved past the stage of needing to explain myself to people who had only ever heard what they wanted to hear and forgotten everything else. Danny, meanwhile, had done what people like him always do when their certainty begins to collapse. He pivoted. He wasn't arrogant anymore, not in the way he had been during those long years where his silence was louder than any insult, but instead he'd softened his edges, repositioned himself as the brother who'd always believed I'd do big things someday. A phrase so painfully nonspecific that I could practically hear it rehearsed, as if he'd practiced saying it in the mirror to see if it sounded authentic. He sent me another message the following Monday, this one longer, apologetic, full of reflections and half-truths, suggesting we grab coffee or lunch or even just talk on the phone sometime soon, whenever you're ready, and for a brief second. I almost admired the effort, the way he tried to thread a needle through a hole he had spent years widening. But by then, I had already made a decision that would shift the dynamic forever, not out of vengeance or malice, but out of a necessity rooted in something deeper than pride, self-respect. The Reynolds Family Trust, which had long been operated through a spider web of outdated bylaws and blind tradition, had over the years acquired a stake in a small, but stable real estate holding company, one that Danny's firm had merged with 3 years ago in an attempt to secure more favorable property deals along the eastern seaboard. It was all very incestuous in that old money, white-collar kind of way, and no one in the family had ever taken the time to untangle who actually owned what. They assumed, as most people in those circles do, that wealth remains static, that the people managing it are loyal by default, and that trust accounts will continue to function like automatic lifelines forever. What they didn't consider, what Danny didn't consider, was that the moment I bought out the company that had quietly consolidated those assets, I became not just a majority shareholder, but a silent puppet master holding the strings to several key positions, including the very board seat that held influence over his promotion. And so, on a bright, deceptively warm Tuesday morning, I walked into a boardroom I had entered only once before, back when I was an intern with a borrowed blazer and a half-written pitch deck, and sat across from a man who'd once brushed past me in the hallway and said, "You're Emily, right? Danny's sister, the artsy one." This time, when I introduced myself, I led not with my last name but with my title. And when I told him that I was here to discuss internal restructuring, he leaned back in his chair just a little, the way people do when something they thought was fixed suddenly starts to shift under their feet. I didn't fire Danny. That would have been too easy, too obvious. Instead, I approved a leadership reshuffle that placed him one rung below a woman he had once described as not executive material. I made sure his budget was cut by just enough to hurt, but not enough to scream foul. I scheduled quarterly reviews he couldn't avoid, and I inserted myself into every major decision pipeline without ever appearing in the office again. It was clean, quiet, undeniable. And when the memo went out, the look on his face, captured in the polite press photo they emailed to the firm, was a masterpiece of forced composure, eyes wide, mouth tight, jaw just slightly clenched. He didn't message me after that. Not a word. Not even a polite follow-up. And I didn't expect him to. Because the kind of man who sends "proud of you" as a first olive branch after years of silence isn't the kind of man who can handle being reminded that the girl he underestimated now had the final say on his professional trajectory. I know there are people who would hear this story and say I went too far, that revenge, however subtle, is never the answer, that families are sacred even when they're flawed, that healing requires forgiveness. Maybe they're right. Maybe there's a version of this story where I smile, take the high road, invite Danny out for lunch, and let bygones be bygones over overpriced lattes and hollow apologies. But that version wouldn't be honest. It wouldn't be real. Because what I needed wasn't an apology. I needed recognition. I needed acknowledgement, not just for what I'd built, but for who I had always been, even when they couldn't see it, even when they looked right past me. And when people ask me now, because they do, always, with wide eyes and awkward smiles, if we've reconnected, if I've let go, if the family has come together since the announcement, I just smile and say, things are different now. Which is the truth, even if it's not the whole truth. Because there's a silence that follows betrayal, a silence more honest than reconciliation, and I've learned to live inside it like a second skin. The last message I ever received from my brother sits unopened in my phone. Not deleted. Not archived. Just there. Waiting. And maybe that's the real ending, not the moment I walked out of the boardroom, not the shifting of power or the subtle punishments, not even the $90 million deal, but the silence that followed, the distance I chose not to cross, the door I left closed not out of anger, but because I finally understood that I didn't need to knock anymore. I had built my own house. With locks only I held the keys to,